What they certainly will do is spread fear and unease among the sort of top echelons of Russia's military. Because if somebody like Lieutenant General Igor Kirillov is vulnerable, then who else is at risk? And he's not the first. He might be the most high-ranking, but there's been a run of these sorts of assassinations over the last few weeks and months.
Now, a high-ranking general in the Russian armed forces has been killed in an explosion in Moscow. Lieutenant General Igor Kirillov, head of the Nuclear, Biological and Chemical Defense Forces, the NBC, was leaving a residential block early on Tuesday when a device hidden in a scooter was detonated. He's the most senior Russian officer to be assassinated during Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I'm joined now by the Sun's defense editor, Jerome Starkey. Jerome, hello, good morning.
Hi, Hugo.
Thanks very much for being with us. Who was this guy, Igor Kirillov? What do you know about him?
Well, so he was the commander. His main role was as the commander of the radiation or radiological, chemical and biological protection troops. So ostensibly that's a unit designed to protect Russia's armed forces from chemical, biological or nuclear attacks, to sort of make sure that they have the right procedures, protocols to protect themselves were that to happen in conflict. But he's also been sanctioned by the United Kingdom allegedly for his alleged involvement in chemical weapons attacks in Ukraine. And that's something we've been seeing more and more as the conflict has gone on. And on top of all of that, he was also a real sort of pro-Putin blowhard. He was someone who would, take to the press conferences, get a microphone whenever he could, spouting the sort of Putin mantra about the reasons for Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But I suppose above all of that, he's just a very high-ranking Russian officer going about his business in Moscow. And attacks like these, whilst they might not in a sort of day-to-day sense really change Russia's ability to prosecute its war, what they certainly will do is spread fear and unease among the sort of top echelons of Russia's military. Because if somebody like Lieutenant General Igor Kirillov is vulnerable, then who else is at risk? And he's not the first. He might be the most high-ranking, but there's been a run of these sorts of assassinations over the last few weeks and months.
So it's more of a propaganda blow than a military blow.
I think it's a little bit of both. And what's very interesting to me is just a few weeks ago, this is something that many people might have missed, but the head of Britain's MI6, Richard Moore, was talking in Paris about the role of the Special Operations Executive during World War II. And you may remember Winston Churchill gave that legendary order to the SOE to set Europe ablaze. And he said then that MI6 was very proud of its history of covert operation. He said they were keeping that heritage alive by helping Ukraine resist Russia's invasion. Yeah, I mean, he didn't give any, as you'd expect, he didn't give any details about the sorts of things Britain is doing. But nonetheless, Ukraine is carrying out a very sophisticated and successful campaign of covert action. Assassinations like this, they're targeting railway lines, they're blowing up factories. It's a mixture of drones, it's a mixture of car bombs. It's clearly part of, a very wide and very successful Ukrainian campaign.
So there's already some history of Ukraine doing this sort of thing within Russia then?
Yeah, absolutely. Just earlier this month, there was a guy called, I might say this wrong, but Sergei Yevsyukov, who was a prison governor. He'd been connected to a prison where a lot of Ukrainian prisoners of war were killed in an explosion. Ukraine categorically accusing him of sort of orchestrating that war crime. He was blown up by a car bomb in Donetsk in November. There was a Russian naval officer killed in Crimea. And if we go back to Kirillov's assassination this morning, it's interesting that Ukraine had just yesterday named him as a sort of suspect in absentia. So a real signalling, if you like, that he was somebody who was in their crosshairs. And then just hours later, this scooter outside, we think was outside his home as he was leaving for work, explodes.
How much do we know about Ukraine's secret service, the SBU? I mean, what's there? Did they spin off out of the Russian secret services a long time ago, or are they a new organization, or what?
So Ukraine has two main intelligence services. They have the SBU, which is the Domestic Intelligence Service. They also have a foreign intelligence service, and they also have a military intelligence service, the GUR. And as far as we know, it's the SBU and the GUR that have been prosecuting the most high-profile operations over the course of this conflict. They seem to operate side by side. It's not, to me, very clear exactly where the delineations of responsibility are. For example, both of them have been using those drones, sea drones, sort of remote-controlled one-way attack, like jet skis, if you like, which have been attacking Russian shipping. They've both been behind a number of attacks, both in the occupied Donbass, in Donetsk and Luhansk, and a mixture of drone strikes and sort of these sabotage and assassination attacks deep inside Russian soil.
And presumably, I mean, Russia would regard this as terrorism. Do we know if there's been any sort of civilian casualties caught up in this attack or other attacks?
This attack, as far as I know, it was just Lieutenant General Kirillov and a military aide, an assistant who was traveling with him. Russia will likely see this as terrorism. Of course, Moscow, you remember, when there was that awful attack on a concert in Moscow, which appeared to be perpetrated by Islamist terrorists coming out of Central Asia. Moscow immediately blamed Ukraine for that. So it's very hard. Ukraine denied it, and we've seen no proof from Russia that Ukraine had any involvement of that. But Ukraine is the bogeyman for Moscow at the moment. Whenever something goes wrong, they like to blame Ukraine, and they like to blame Ukraine's Western backers, particularly Britain and the United States.
And presumably Russia's doing the same sort of thing inside Ukraine as well.
Not just inside Ukraine. I mean, Russia's been carrying out these sorts of sabotage attacks across Europe as well, and we just have to cast our minds back to the Skripal attacks in Salisbury that left Dawn Sturgis dead. In the last few months, we've seen these combustible devices they've been described as, we think, but ultimately mechanisms that catch fire and can ignite fires put on aeroplanes, and they've ignited in DHL freight warehouses, one in Birmingham, one in Germany. Poland says it's arrested a number of people suspected of being behind those sabotage attacks. And of course, assassinations as well.
And Vladimir Putin has his annual press conference later this week, doesn't he? Are you expecting this to be a feature?
Ukraine and the conflict in Ukraine should clearly be a feature. And I think whether or not Russia has any appetite, whether he has any appetite to negotiate, because the talk around the world, I think on both sides of this conflict, is that it must draw to an end, and that certainly we've heard from Keir Starmer, we've heard from NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte, language about putting Ukraine in the strongest position for negotiations. But where before we were hearing Ukraine's allies talk about, supporting them for as long as it takes to win, now the language appears to be supporting them for as long as it takes to have a successful negotiation.
Thank you very much indeed, Jerome Starkey. Jerome is, of course, The Sun's defence editor.
A statement purporting to be the first by Syria's ousted President Bashar al-Assad said his departure from Syria was neither planned nor occurred during the final hours of the battles. The written statement, published on Monday on the Syrian presidency's Telegram channel, was posted from Moscow, where Assad has been granted asylum. It said he wanted to address distortions given during a critical juncture in the nation's history. And at no point did he consider stepping down, seeking refuge, or did he receive a proposal from an individual party. Reuters reported last week that Assad confided in almost no one about his plans to flee Syria. Aides, officials and even relatives were deceived or kept in the dark. More than a dozen people with knowledge of the events told Reuters. He was ousted after insurgent forces led by the Islamist Hayat Tahrir al-Sham swept through Syria in a lightning offensive, ending more than 50 years of iron-fisted rule by his family. Assad wrote that he left Damascus to manage combat operations from Hamiman base in Latakia on December 8. But after it came under drone attack, Moscow requested the base's command arrange an immediate evacuation to Russia. President Vladimir Putin made the decision to grant Assad asylum in Russia, which deployed its air force to Syria in 2015 to help him repel rebel forces.